internal limit to capital, that wound or that cut, right, which in a sense institutes conscious life, right, which in a sense institutes the potentiality that one calls life, right? Is it, what does it mean to address that cut? What does it mean to speak to that cut, right? So a great deal of ethical, sort of unfolding and peeling, going beneath the layers, trying to enter into the crypt, so to speak, is involved here. How does one do this in a way that is pitched on the level of a certain kind of generosity, on a certain kind of openness? So there is a paradox here, that the more deeply one enters into the crypt or into the wound or into the cut, the more one is in a sense moving away from the possibility of the open. Right? So there is that fundamental problem that any kind of soul work, any kind of restorative attempt to elaborate something like the internal limit to capital finds itself to be moving into a domain that one would call the domain of the secret. Right? And the secret is something that one usually opposes to be open. So in a sense, one is moving away from even the possibility of politics in the open, and one is moving into other areas which are in a sense secretive, which in fact have no place in the open. So that is another paradox, that the moment one enters into this in any constructive fashion, one finds that one is pushed back into the realm of the secret. So to give you one very concrete instance of that, it's very common among many Dalit intellectuals. In particular, I'm thinking of one of your colleagues here, Gopal Guru, in his wonderful book co-written with Sundar Sarkai, which is called The Cracked Mirror. It is something that he has said again and again, and many other people have said similar things, that in fact the notion of caste is something that is always at the back of everyone's mind. Just the other day I heard a talk by a Dalit short story writer called Achia, who in a sense said something similar. The idea that at the back of everyone's mind is the notion of caste. Right? And if you see the problem here, that if it is true that there is something like a political unconscious wherein one can never actually rid oneself of the notion of caste, there then becomes one can then draw something like a relation between the problem of caste and the problem of the secret. Right? So caste is a secret. Now the moment you say this, it's scandalous, because in any kind of Dalit mobilization, were you to say that caste is a secret, there would be immediately the fear or the concern that one is moving away from the open. Right? So the problem of the minimal is a problem that in a sense makes us or makes reason oscillate between the secretive and the open. And that again leads us to a further problem. Right? The oscillation between the secretive and the open is a further problem, because in some sense, and Prasanta very beautifully spoke about the grand scene of the 18th century with pamphlets and with millenarian wishes and so on and so forth. The fact is that there is in minimality a deep desire to inaugurate an open, right? I'm not necessarily thinking of civil society, but I'm thinking of the open, that is to say, in the very old sense of the term, the agora, right? Nonetheless, there is something in the minimal that is agoraphobic. It doesn't really want to be part of the agora. It wants to, because the moment you enter into any kind of nuance, any kind of subtleness of the soul, there is the problem of the fact that one is veering away from the open. So in a sense, what the question I am asking is, how then to imagine the open from within the notion of a minimal that keeps to itself. The minimal returns to itself, it keeps to itself, but it nonetheless inaugurates the open. Right? So I would certainly not wish that a book like Shrapnel Minima be taken to be some kind of an explosive utterance in the open. It seems to me that the very fragmentary nature of its contents, the fact that all these interventions are so minimal, are so transient, are so fleeting, that they partake of the fugitive. All this reminds us of the fact there is much in the minimal that is in fact self-concealing. Right? Is there then, in the possibility that that is opening up now, vis-a-vis the problem of capital, is there something that's opening up now that in fact invites us to imagine the self-concealment of the minimal, right? Or that is to say, what is that in the open which nonetheless returns to itself, right? And somewhere in that movement of the minimal toward itself, somewhere in that keeping to itself, I think there may be the possibility of a new kind of subjectivity. So my final point would be that somewhere in that subjectivity, why do I call it a subjectivity? Because subjectivity would no longer be the self, would no longer be the empowered self, would no longer be the militant self, or the self that has entered into civil society. It would be this particular movement which in fact takes the secret seriously, and that uses the minimal as a kind of a ruse. So I would like you to think seriously about the idea that one way in which a new kind of care of the self might emerge in the 100 years after the last attempt was made in Gujarat might well be a care of the self that is now cognizant of the relation between politics and secrecy. And it's in that kind it's in that space that I think one should locate the work and the project of both Humanities. I mean, I hope I haven't scandalized them by elaborating it in this way. But it seems to me that therein lies the future work of Humanities, as well as the book Shatner's Minima. So in some sense, I'm asking very quickly for two things, finally. Is there a response to the response to Resentiment? Right? And therefore, the revaluation of values that must take place at the innermost, within the innermost recesses of wherever the valuation is going on. Right? I won't call it the soul, or I won't call it the inner life, or I won't call it spirituality, I won't call it meditation, yoga, wherever. But in that culture, in that possibility of retreat, is that the place where there will be a revaluation? Because if that were not the case, right, there would really be no future for the humanities, right? And the second very quick point is whether there is in the open, in modern humanities, in Shatner and Minima, whether it provides us with a wherewithal to actually speak to the wound, to actually speak to the cut. Right? Whether it has given us the courage and the hope to actually do that. So I'm speaking somewhat with the idea that we are living in dark times, and so a little more pessimistic than what Prasanta had laid out. But I feel as though it would be my sense of what the larger project is, and I'm happy to answer questions about this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So may I request, Rakesh Pandey from CSTS to share his thoughts.
I know I'm in the sense of academic training and disciplinary affiliations, I'm a bit of outsider in the sense that I'm not trained in English, I'm not trained in literature. I do history, and I should say I do some kind of history. Maybe just this sense that I do some kind of history, and that's what I'm trained in. I have a certain interest in this very word, humanities. When Prasanta asked me to speak, the only reason I agreed was that I have a certain fascination for this word, humanities, a very deep fascination, I should say. And that fascination is also there because I work in a social science research institute where one can happily, at least I can, describe oneself as doing humanities, and I do that. So it's part of my self-description, definitely, and which I do rather joyously. But I also want to make a point when I say that I do humanities, and that's a much subtle point. It's a deep point which I try to make when I say that I do humanities. And I'll come to some of the points which I would like to raise here. But the way in which we talk about humanities, and frankly we don't talk about humanities, I try to recall, if at all I have read something about humanities, and I still haven't got a single reference in my mind. Humanities in relation to Indian academic intellectual practices, none. Social sciences, yes. Occasionally you find pieces in EPW and other places. Sometimes some kind of depressing note in some newspapers, what's happening with social sciences, but rarely with what is happening to our humanities. Unless until someone comes from very, very far off place and tells you that you have lost your classics, or someone comes and tells you that you have lost your languages. In short, someone comes and tells you that, well, you are losing the skill to reflect on yourself. And sometimes we become very busy actually. We start talking to each other, and we start mimicking that complaint which is coming from outside, which is about ourselves. And I think there is a sense in which we do realize that there is something has happened to our kind of humanities. And Prasanta gave us a very interesting list of important, illustrious list of journals, Western tradition of journals in the West, from Dissent to New York Review of Books, London Review of Books, and where you can actually have a 6,000 word long thesis. We don't have such tradition in this country. Maybe in some places in literary journals in Indian languages, in Indian languages as bhashas, we have that tradition. I have my views on that, which I can share independently, that something has happened to that, and that is a separate independent topic. So that's another reason. The final point is that what are the meanings of this word in our context? That is what brings me here. In a context which Milind rightly mentioned, which has always a background, which is like caste. In short, it's a deeply uneven, unequal society where we end up speaking a language which is mostly a language of privilege. We speak our privileges, and we do that very, very loudly, sometimes very proudly, rather obsessively. We mimic. As if we have no language. And by extension, as if we have no life. I think the question of humanities is a question which takes us back to the question of life and the poem which you read in the beginning. Let me just I was trying to collect my thoughts on this, and I thought that the best way would be to just try to organize some of these things. So what I'll do is that may be a bit boring for some of you. Just read certain things which I tried to think through. On the question of novelty, which is the topic of discussion. What's new in the newness question in our times when endurance is a rare quality? Repetition with an ingrained method is root to innovation. I'm sure while talking of the new, we are not thinking of innovation here, which is largely a product of rearranging what is already given to us. The new has always been hardness to the temporal. This moment, the now moment, which is every ever-passing flow of time. While thinking of the new between past and future, which is the topic of this discussion, do we miss the fleeting, the passing, the ephemeral moment? You may recall that this is how the modern was most evocatively defined in the mid-19th century Europe. And this had peculiar charm throughout the 20th century reflections on the concept. Are we seeking a new route to the concept of modernity by getting back to the very idea of new? But more than the new, the word which is at the heart of the exploration of modernity or modern times, which had constituted the human, a sustained search for the modes and forms of the human was a deeply linguistic and literary enterprise. In the Renaissance or early modern Europe, it was more of laying the foundations of new knowledge and pedagogic systems and institutions in a Greco-Roman, or what is known as the classical scheme of things in the Western world. It was based on fundamental skills in ancient and classical languages and scholasticism. The intellectual enterprise around the human was essentially textual, based on how accurately and faithfully one would make sense of what the great achievers of humanity had left in store. Novelty was the act of looking back, making sense of the past, placing oneself